My greedy cousin thought he was stealing $1 billion empire from me, but he didn't realize the inheritance came with a terrifying secret locked in the basement. In the Thorne family, you don't actually inherit the fortune. You become the human sacrifice that keeps it alive. The rain at Ironwood Estate never just fell. It hammered against the gray stone walls like it was trying to break inside and drown us all. Inside the great library, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment, expensive bourbon, and the suffocating stench of Julian's entitlement. Julian, my cousin, stood by the mahogany desk, swirling a glass of 30-year-old scotch. He looked like the poster boy for old money, tailored Italian suit, hair perfectly slicked back, and a smirk that suggested he already owned the air we were breathing. To the rest of the world, Julian was the golden child, the charismatic heir apparent to the Thorne Empire. To me, he was a vulture who had been circling my father's fading health for years. "Cheer up, Elias," Julian said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. He didn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on the heavy, brass-bound ledger sitting in the center of the desk. "Once the paperwork is signed today, I'll make sure you're taken care of. Maybe a nice cottage on the edge of the property? Somewhere quiet where you can, well, whatever it is you do." I sat in the shadows of a wingback chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I didn't say a word. I'd spent 25 years being the quiet Thorne, the son who stayed in the background while my father, Silas, built a mountain of wealth on the bones of his competitors. Everyone, Julian included, thought I was the disappointment, the soft one, the one who didn't have the stomach for the family business. "My father isn't dead yet, Julian," I said softly. Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Please, Silas hasn't left his room in 3 days. The doctors are speaking in whispers, and the board is already looking to me for direction. Your father was a titan, Elias, but even titans crumble. He knows the business needs a shark, not a poet." The doors at the far end of the library creaked open. Mr. Sterling, my father's personal attorney for 4 decades, walked in. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. He was carrying a single thin file, not the thick stack of inheritance papers Julian was clearly expecting. Julian straightened his tie, his smirk growing wider. "Ah, Sterling. Ready to finalize the transition? I've already briefed the press for an announcement tomorrow morning. The new era of Thorne Holdings. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" Sterling didn't look at Julian. He walked straight to the desk, his eyes darting toward me for a fraction of a second before he cleared his throat. "Mr. Thorne has regained enough strength to issue his final directive regarding the succession and the family birthright. He has requested that I read it immediately." Of course," Julian said, stepping closer to the desk, practically salivating. "The birthright, the manor, the controlling shares, the trust funds. Let's get on with it." Sterling opened the file. "Regarding the primary estate of Ironwood, all subsidiary holdings, and the controlling interest in Thorne Global, these assets are no longer part of the family trust." The room went silent. The only sound was the rain lashing against the windows. Julian's smirk faltered. "I'm sorry? What do you mean, no longer part of the trust?" 6 hours ago," Sterling continued, his voice trembling slightly, "Silas Thorne executed a total divestment. The properties have been liquidated. The shares have been moved into a private entity that is not governed by the Thorne family bylaws." Julian's glass hit the floor. It didn't shatter. It just thudded against the thick rug, the amber liquid soaking into the fibers like a bloodstain. He sold it? Everything? The birthright? The legacy? It's all gone?" "Not gone," Sterling said, finally looking Julian in the eye. "Transferred. To a single beneficiary. But there's a condition." Julian's face turned a mottled shade of purple. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the desk. "To who? I'm the eldest male heir of the next generation. My father's will was clear. My birthright is gone. My birthright is gone?" He started screaming now, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and genuine terror. He turned to me, his eyes wild. "What did you do? You whispered in his ear, didn't you? You pathetic little—" "Julian," I interrupted, my voice still quiet, still calm. "I haven't spoken to my father in weeks." That was the truth. But what Julian didn't know was that my father didn't need to speak to me to tell me his intentions. He had been training me in the shadows for a decade, teaching me that the loudest person in the room is usually the most vulnerable. "The birthright isn't gone, Julian," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you aren't the one receiving it. The entity that now owns everything, the house we are standing in, the clothes on your back, the very ground beneath your feet, is owned entirely by your cousin, Elias." Julian froze. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. "He gave it all to him? To the coward?" "There's more," Sterling said, reaching into the file and pulling out a small blackened key. It looked ancient, far older than the house itself. "Silas left a message for you, Julian," he said. "The birthright was never the money. The birthright was the burden, and since you love the crown so much, you can have the only thing Elias didn't want." Sterling turned to me and handed me the file. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew what was in that file. I knew what my father's true intentions were, and they had nothing to do with rewarding me. They were a trap, a beautiful, gilded, lethal trap. Julian stepped toward me, his hands shaking. "Give it to me. Elias, give me the papers. You don't know what you're doing. You can't run this. You're a nobody." I looked down at the blackened key in Sterling's hand. Then I looked up at the ceiling, toward the room where my father lay dying, or perhaps waiting. "You're right, Julian," I said, a cold realization settling in my gut. "I don't want it. But you don't understand. He didn't give me the company to make me rich. He gave it to me to hide what's buried underneath it." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the library slammed shut on their own, and the lights flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. From the floor above, we heard it, a slow, rhythmic thud, the sound of someone or something dragging itself across the floor toward the stairs. "Elias!" Julian's voice was small now, stripped of all its bravado. "What is that?" I felt the weight of the file in my hand. "That," I whispered into the dark, "is the rest of your birthright." The darkness in the library was so absolute it felt physical, like a cold, wet shroud pressing against my skin. I could hear Julian's ragged breathing a few feet away, sharp, hitching gasps that betrayed the terror he was trying so hard to mask with rage. "Elias, stop this!" Julian hissed, his voice trembling. "Whatever game this is, whatever theater your father set up to scare me, it's over. Turn the lights back on." "I didn't turn them off, Julian," I whispered. My fingers tightened around the file Sterling had given me. The paper felt strangely warm, almost pulsing, as if there was a heartbeat trapped between the layers of manila. The thudding sound from the floor above started again. Thump, drag, thump, drag. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy, far too heavy for a man as frail as my father had become. It sounded like someone dragging a sack of wet stones across the hardwood floor. Thump, drag, it reached the top of the grand staircase. Julian fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. A weak, flickering beam of light cut through the gloom. The light didn't bring comfort. It only highlighted the swirling dust motes and the way the shadows in the corners of the library seemed to stretch and lean toward us. "Mr. Sterling?" Julian called out, his voice cracking. "Sterling, where are you?" There was no answer. I looked toward where the attorney had been standing only moments ago. The spot was empty. The blackened key he had been holding lay on the rug, gleaming dully in the light of Julian's phone. Sterling was gone. Not just moved, vanished. The heavy oak doors were still bolted from the inside. There was no way he could have left. "He's gone, Julian," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "He did his job. He passed the burden." "Shut up about the burden," Julian snapped, spinning around to face me. The phone light hit my eyes, blinding me. "This is a trick. You and Sterling, you're trying to force me out so you can have it all." "Well, it won't work. I know the law. That file in your hand? It's mine by right. Give it to me." He lunged at me, his face twisted into a mask of desperate greed. Even in the face of the inexplicable, Julian's obsession with the Thorne fortune was his primary instinct. He grabbed the edge of the file, and for a second, we were locked in a silent struggle. "Let go, Elias," he growled. "You don't want to see what's inside, Julian," I warned, but he was stronger than he looked. He yanked the file from my grip, the cardboard tearing slightly. He scrambled back, his breath coming in jagged gulps, and pinned the file against the mahogany desk. With his phone clamped between his jaw and shoulder, he tore the folder open. I watched his face. I watched the greed turn into confusion, then into a pale, sickly realization. "What is this?" he muttered, flipping through the pages. "These aren't deeds. These aren't bank statements. It's a ledger of names, dates, debt repaid, interest accrued." He stopped, his eyes widening. "Elias, these dates, they go back 300 years. And the names, they're all Thorne employees, people who disappeared or retired early." "Look at the last page, Julian," I said softly. He flipped to the back. A single photograph was tucked into a plastic sleeve. It was a picture of my father, but not the man I knew. He looked young, perhaps in his 20s, but his eyes were wide with a vacant, glazed expression. He was standing in front of a heavy iron door in the basement of this very house, a door I had been told never to approach. Underneath the photo, in my father's own precise, elegant handwriting, were the words, "The price of the empire is a life for a life. The heir receives the gold. The spare receives the key. But when there is only one who is worthy, he must hold both the crown and the leash." "What leash?" Julian whispered. "Elias, what does he mean?" Thump, drag, thump, drag. The sound was on the stairs now. It was halfway down. Each thump vibrated through the floorboards, rattling the crystal decanters on the side table. "My father didn't build this company on smart investments, Julian," I said, the truth finally clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. "He built it on a contract. He was a caretaker. This house, the Thorne holdings, it's all just a bribe, a payment to keep something contained." "You're insane," Julian hissed, but he was backing away from the library doors. "You've lost your mind." "Why do you think he hated me so much?" I asked, stepping toward him. "Why did he call me weak? It wasn't because I didn't have the stomach for business. It was because he didn't think I had the stomach to be a jailer. He wanted you, Julian. He wanted your ruthlessness. He wanted your lack of empathy. You were the perfect candidate to take over the burden. But at the last second, he changed his mind." "Because he loved you?" Julian sneered, though his voice was trembling. "No," I said, looking at the library door. "Because he hated you more. He knew that if he gave it to me, I would try to end it. And he knew that if I tried to end it, I would be the first one it ate." The dragging sound stopped. It was right outside the library. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, pressurized silence that made my ears pop. Then the wood of the door began to groan, not the hinges, the wood itself. It started to bow inward as if something incredibly heavy was leaning against it. "Elias?" Julian whispered, dropping the file. The papers scattered across the floor. "Open the door. Use the key. Maybe if we give it what it wants." "I don't have the key, Julian," I said, pointing to the rug. "You dropped it." Julian looked down at the blackened key. He scrambled to his knees, reaching for it, but just as his fingers were about to close around the metal, the library doors didn't open. They shattered. The heavy oak exploded inward in a spray of splinters. A freezing wind rushed into the room, smelling of salt, rot, and something ancient. Julian screamed as he was knocked backward by the force of the blast. The flickering light of his phone rolled across the floor, illuminating the doorway for a split second. Standing there wasn't a monster or a ghost or my father. It was a woman. She was wearing a tattered silk dress from an era long gone, her hair a wild, matted halo around a face that was perfectly, terrifyingly youthful. But her eyes were the same cold, piercing blue as my father's. She didn't look at Julian. She looked straight at me. "The debt is past due, Elias," she said. Her voice didn't come from her throat. It echoed inside my skull, vibrating against my teeth. "The old man is gone. He promised me a fresh soul to hold the leash." She stepped into the room, and as she did, the shadows seemed to flow toward her like water down a drain. Julian, terrified and desperate, lunged for the key again, thinking it was his salvation. "I'll do it," he screamed. "I'll be the heir. I'll take the burden. Just don't kill me." The woman stopped. She turned her head toward Julian with a slow, mechanical jerk. A terrifying, beautiful smile spread across her face. "The spare wants the crown," she whispered. She reached out a pale, translucent hand toward Julian. But she wasn't reaching for him. She was reaching for the shadow attached to his feet. She grabbed his shadow by the throat and began to pull. Julian's scream was cut short as his body began to turn gray, his skin becoming as translucent as hers. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a silent plea, as he began to dissolve into the darkness. "Wait," I shouted, taking a step forward. "The file said there was a condition. My father had a condition." The woman paused, her hand still clamped onto Julian's fading essence. She turned back to me, her smile fading into a look of predatory curiosity. "A condition?" "He didn't give me the inheritance to keep you here," I said, my heart hammering. "He gave it to me to show me how to break the contract." The woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "To break it? Many have tried, Elias Thorne. All of them are part of me now." She stepped closer, leaving Julian's half-vanished form slumped on the floor. She leaned in, her face inches from mine. "And what makes you think you're any different from your father?" "Because," I whispered, reaching into my pocket for the one thing I hadn't told Julian about, the thing I had taken from my father's bedside before he died. My father didn't give me his strength. He gave me his confession. I pulled out a small silver locket and flipped it open. Inside wasn't a picture, but a tiny glass vial filled with a shimmering golden liquid. The woman's eyes went wide. For the first time, I saw something other than hunger in them. I saw fear. "Where did you get that?" she hissed, recoiling. "The birthright isn't the money or the house or the leash," I said, my voice growing stronger. "The birthright is the truth, and the truth is you aren't the one in charge." I uncorked the vial, but before I could pour it out, the house gave a violent lurch. The floor beneath us groaned and began to tilt. From deep within the foundations of Ironwood Estate, a roar erupted. Not a human roar, but the sound of the earth itself screaming. "The vial!" Julian gasped from the floor, his voice barely a ghost of a sound. "Elias, use it, or we're both." The floorboards beneath Julian suddenly buckled and snapped. A massive black tendril, thicker than a human waist, erupted from the ground and coiled around his waist. Before I could move, it yanked him downward into the dark maw of the house. "Elias!" his voice echoed from the depths. I looked at the woman, then at the hole where my cousin had disappeared. The golden liquid in the vial began to glow with a blinding intensity. "Choose, Elias," the woman whispered, her fear replaced by a cruel, mocking grin. "The cousin you hate, or the soul you're trying to save. You can't have both." The roar of the house, drowning out Julian's scream, was a sound I will never forget. It was the sound of a century of secrets finally splitting the foundation of our lives. The library floor had become a jagged maw of splintered wood and rising shadows. Below, in the lightless void where the cellar should have been, I could hear Julian's fingernails scraping against stone as the black tendril dragged him deeper. The woman in the tattered silk dress watched me, her expression a terrifying blend of hunger and anticipation. She didn't move to stop me. She didn't need to. She knew the weight of the choice I was carrying. "Save him, Elias," she whispered, her voice vibrating through the soles of my feet. "Save the man who would have cast you into the street without a second thought. Pour the confession into the dark. Give up your only weapon for a cousin who hates you." I looked down at the vial. The golden liquid inside was swirling now, faster and faster, emitting a soft, rhythmic pulse. This was my father's final act of rebellion, the confession of how the Thorne family had trapped her, how they had stolen her life to build their empire. If I poured it onto her, it would break the binding. She would be free, and the Thorne empire, the money, the influence, the estate, would crumble into dust as the debt was finally canceled. But Julian was being pulled into the mechanism of the house itself. If I didn't use the vial to light my way down and find him, he was dead. "I'm not doing it for him," I said, my voice cracking. I didn't wait for her response. I leapt into the hole. The fall was shorter than I expected, but the impact was jarring. I landed on a cold, slick floor that smelled of stagnant water and old copper. The air was so thick it felt like breathing through wet wool. I scrambled to my feet, holding the vial aloft. Its golden glow cut through the darkness like a beacon, revealing a subterranean chamber I had never seen on any floor plan of Ironwood. This wasn't a basement. It was a cathedral of bone and iron. The walls were lined with the same heavy black metal as the key Sterling had shown us. And there, at the far end of the room, was the iron door from the photograph. Julian was pinned against it. The black tendril had wound itself around his chest, tightening with every breath he took. His face was ghostly pale, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Julian!" I shouted, running toward him. As I approached, the shadows at the edges of the light began to hiss. The woman appeared from the darkness, her form flickering like a dying candle. She wasn't just a spirit, she was a part of this place. "You're too late, little Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "The house is hungry. It hasn't been fed in a long time. Your father kept it at bay with small sacrifices, employees, rivals, the occasional disappearance. But it wants a Thorne now. It wants the blood that signed the contract." "Then take me," I yelled, thrusting the vial toward her. "The contract is built on a lie. My father confessed it all." She laughed, and the sound caused the iron walls to ring. "A confession is just words, Elias. This house is built on blood. Do you know why your father chose you to be the heir and Julian to be the spare?" I stopped, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. "He didn't choose you because you were the quiet one," she sneered, gliding closer. "He chose you because you were the only one who wouldn't fight back when the time came to pay the bill. He knew Julian would burn the world down to save himself. But you're a martyr. You're exactly like your mother." She pointed a long, translucent finger at the iron door. "The condition wasn't about breaking the contract, Elias. It was about fulfilling it. Your father didn't give you that vial to save Julian. He gave it to you to prime the pump." Julian let out a choked, wet gasp. "Elias, please, it's behind the door." I looked at the iron door. It wasn't just a door anymore. It was breathing. The heavy metal surface was pulsing in sync with the vial in my hand. "What's behind the door?" I demanded, turning back to the woman. "The source," she replied. "The thing your great-grandfather found in the woods 300 years ago. The thing that gave the Thornes everything they ever wanted in exchange for one soul every 50 years. And today is the 50th year, Elias. To the hour." The vial in my hand began to vibrate so violently that I nearly dropped it. The golden liquid turned from a soft glow to a blinding, searing white. "If you pour that liquid on the door," The woman whispered, her voice suddenly soft, almost pitying. "You'll save your cousin. The tendrils will release him, but the door will open, and once it's open, there's no closing it. The debt won't just be paid, it will be set free upon the world." I looked at Julian. He was dying. His ribs were literally cracking under the pressure of the tendril. Then I looked at the vial, the confession. It was a trap within a trap. My father hadn't given me a weapon, he'd given me the key to an apocalypse, wrapped in the guise of a moral choice. "Elias, don't," Julian wheezed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Don't let it out." Even now, in his final moments, my selfish, entitled cousin was terrified of what lay beyond that door. I stood there, the light of the vial burning my palm. If I stayed silent, Julian died, and the secret stayed buried for another 50 years. If I acted, I saved a man who didn't deserve it and unleashed something that might destroy everything. The woman leaned in, her breath smelling of ancient dust. "Which one are you, Elias? The hero who lets his brother die, or the fool who burns the world for a villain?" The iron door let out a deafening clunk. A bolt the size of my arm slid back, then another, and another. The door wasn't waiting for me to choose. The proximity of the vial was already triggering the release. "It's happening," the woman whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and joy. "The birthright is coming home." The door creaked open just an inch. From the darkness within, a sound emerged. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was a voice that sounded exactly like mine, but layered with 1,000 other whispers. "Elias," the voice said from behind the door, "thank you for bringing the light." The vial in my hand shattered. The golden liquid didn't fall to the floor. It defied gravity, screaming through the air and into the crack in the door. The door swung wide with a force that knocked me off my feet. A wave of cold black pressure surged out, throwing the woman back into the shadows and snapping the tendrils around Julian. As I scrambled backward, gasping for air, a hand reached out from the darkness inside the vault. It was a human hand, warm, solid, and covered in the same Thorn family signet ring that I wore on my own finger. But as the figure stepped out into the light of the dying embers of the vial, I realized it wasn't my father. It wasn't my grandfather. The man who stepped out of the vault looked exactly like me, not a twin, not a reflection. He was me. But his eyes were filled with a darkness that no human soul should contain. He looked at Julian, who was shivering on the floor. Then he looked at me and smiled. "You did well, Elias," the other me said, his voice a perfect mirror of mine. "But you forgot the most important rule of the Thorn family." He stepped toward me, and as he did, I felt my own body beginning to fade, my hands turning translucent just like the woman's had. "What rule?" I gasped, my voice growing faint. The other Elias leaned down and whispered into my ear, "The heir never actually inherits. The heir is just the new skin." He reached out and grabbed my throat, and I felt my consciousness being pulled toward the open vault. But just as the world began to go black, I saw Julian's hand move. He wasn't reaching for me. He was reaching for the blackened key that had fallen through the hole with us. Julian's eyes met mine, not with fear, but with a cold, calculating resolve I'd never seen before. "Sorry, Elias," Julian whispered, "but there can only be one head of the house." And then he turned the key in the air, and the entire room began to fold in on itself. The sound of the key turning wasn't a click. It was a scream, a high-pitched, metallic shriek that vibrated through my teeth and made my vision fracture into 1,000 jagged pieces. The library, the cathedral of bone, the vault, it all began to tilt and buckle. Space didn't just fold, it curdled. The corners of the room stretched into impossible angles, and the floor felt like it was turning into liquid. I saw Julian standing at the center of the distortion, holding the blackened key high like a holy relic. His face, once pale with terror, was now twisted into a mask of manic triumph. "I see it now," Julian yelled over the roar of the collapsing reality. "The key doesn't just open the door, Elias. It's the anchor. It controls the flow. You were too weak to use it, but I'm not. I'm the head of the house now." The other Elias, the entity that had stepped out of the vault, didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still as the world dissolved around him. He looked at Julian with an expression of mild, almost bored curiosity. "You think the key makes you the master?" the entity said. His voice was a perfect, chilling replica of my own, but it carried an undertone of grinding stone. "That key was forged from the shackles of the first thorn who tried to run. It's not a tool of authority, little cousin. It's a lightning rod." I felt my body being pulled toward the entity. My hands were almost completely invisible now, nothing more than wisps of gray smoke against the flickering light. The pain was unbearable. It felt like my memories were being peeled off my brain like old wallpaper. I saw flashes of my childhood. My father's cold eyes, the smell of the library, the sound of my mother's voice before she disappeared. All of it was being sucked into the vacuum that the other Elias had created. "Elias!" Julian shouted, looking at me. "Don't you get it? Your father didn't give you the inheritance to save you. He gave it to you so you'd be the one standing here when the clock struck 50. He used you as a sacrificial lamb to keep the entity fed, but he forgot about me. He forgot that I have the blood, too." Julian lunged toward the entity, thrusting the key forward. "I command you, get back into the vault. By the blood of the thorn line, I claim the birthright." The entity laughed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated cruelty. He reached out and caught Julian's wrist with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. There was a sickening crack, and Julian let out a howl of agony as the key fell from his limp fingers. "The blood of the thorn line is a poison, Julian," the entity whispered, pulling him closer. "And I've been drinking it for 300 years. You don't claim me, I am the claim." Suddenly, the entity's face began to ripple. The features that looked like mine, my nose, my jawline, my eyes, began to melt and shift. For a heartbeat, I saw my father's face, then my grandfather's, then faces I didn't recognize, hundreds of them, all screaming in a silent, superimposed chorus of agony. "The birthright isn't the wealth, Julian," the entity hissed, his voice now a cacophony of 1,000 dead thorns. "The birthright is the vessel. Every 50 years, the brightest and the strongest of you are culled to provide a new skin for the business. Thorn Holdings isn't a company. It's a parasite that wears your name." The entity turned its gaze back to me. "And your father. He was the cleverest of all. He knew he couldn't stop the cycle, so he chose the one who would be the most compatible. The one who was already hollowed out by his own father's neglect. He chose you, Elias, because there was so little of you left to fight back." The room gave another violent lurch. The walls of the bone cathedral were being pulled into the entity's chest, forming a swirling vortex of shadow. Julian was being dragged along with it, his feet slipping on the slick floor. "No!" I screamed, though my voice was barely a whisper now. "There has to be another way. The vial, the confession." "The confession was a lie, Elias." The woman's voice echoed from the shadows. She appeared beside me, her tattered dress fluttering in a wind that shouldn't have existed. She looked at me with those cold blue eyes, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something like regret. "Your father didn't write a confession to free me. He wrote it to anchor you. The golden liquid wasn't a cure. It was a sedative. It was meant to keep your soul still while the shift happened." Everything clicked. My father hadn't been training me to be a leader or even a jailer. He had been seasoning me. Every quiet hour in the library, every book I was forced to read, every cold silence, it was all designed to make me the perfect empty vessel for the thing that lived under Ironwood. "My birthright isn't gone," I whispered. the realization hitting me harder than the physical pain. It's finally here. Julian was crying now, his bravado completely shattered. He was clinging to a jagged piece of the floor, his eyes wide with the realization that he had fought so hard to inherit a death sentence. "Elias, do something. You have the control. You're the heir. Stop it." I looked at my hands. They were almost gone. But in the center of my fading palm, I saw a tiny dark spot. It wasn't gray, and it wasn't golden. It was a deep, bruised purple. It was the one thing my father hadn't been able to empty out of me, my hatred for him. "You're right, Julian," I said, a cold, sharp clarity settling over me. "I am the heir, and the heir gets to decide what happens to the estate." I didn't reach for the key. I didn't reach for the entity. I reached for Julian. With the last of my fading strength, I threw myself forward, not at the entity, but at my cousin. I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him toward the entity. "If it wants a thorn," I growled, "it can have the one who actually wanted the job." The entity's eyes widened in surprise. This wasn't part of the script. The quiet Elias wasn't supposed to fight back. The vortex momentarily stuttered as I shoved Julian into the entity's grasping arms. The two of them collided in a burst of black static. The entity's form began to wrap around Julian, his skin beginning to fuse with the shifting, screaming shadows. Julian's screams were muffled as his face was slowly replaced by the entity's blank, porcelain mask. For a second, I felt my own body begin to solidify. The gray smoke was turning back into flesh. I was winning. I was pushing the burden onto the man who had craved it. But then, the woman let out a piercing shriek. She pointed toward the iron door, which was now vibrating with a frequency that made the very air catch fire. "You fool!" she screamed. "You can't just swap the souls. The contract requires a willing sacrifice or a total vacancy. By forcing him, you haven't filled the vessel. You've cracked it." The iron door didn't just open this time. It disintegrated. And from the abyss beyond the door, something emerged that made the entity and the woman look like children's toys. It was a hand, but it was made of nothing but white, blinding light, and ancient, rusted chains. It reached out and grabbed the entire swirling mass, the entity, Julian, and the library itself. As the light consumed the room, I felt a sudden sickening weightlessness. I wasn't being pulled into the vault. I was being pushed out. The last thing I saw before the world turned white was Julian's face, half merged with the entity, looking at me with a terrifying grin. "Thanks for the seed, Elias," Julian's voice said, sounding perfectly clear and perfectly sane. "But you should have checked the basement one level down." The ground vanished. I was falling through a tunnel of screaming wind and blinding light. When I finally hit the ground, it wasn't the library floor. It was cold, damp grass. I gasped for air, clutching my chest. I was outside. It was dawn. The rain had stopped. I looked up, expecting to see the gray stone walls of Ironwood Estate. Instead, I was standing in the middle of an empty, weed-choked field. There was no house, no library, no Thorn Empire. Just a single rusted iron gate standing in the middle of nowhere, and a small wooden sign that read, "Property of Elias Thorn." I looked down at my hand. The signet ring was gone. In its place was a brand burned into my skin, a symbol I had never seen before, pulsing with a faint rhythmic light. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with shaking hands. It was a news alert. The headline made the blood freeze in my veins. "Ironwood Estate Tragedy. New heir Elias Thorn confirmed dead in freak fire. Cousin Julian Thorn emerges as sole survivor and CEO of Thorn Global." I stared at the screen, then at the empty field around me. I was alive, but the world thought I was dead. And Julian was out there, wearing my name, my life, and whatever that thing was. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the shadow I saw moving at the edge of the field. It was tall, dressed in a tailored Italian suit, and it was walking toward me with a familiar, arrogant stride. It stopped 10 feet away and looked at me. It had Julian's face, but when it spoke, it was my father's voice that came out. "Did you really think it was that easy to quit the family business, son?" The figure wearing Julian's face stepped closer, the morning sun casting a long, distorted shadow behind him. The voice was unmistakably my father's, cold, resonant, and devoid of the frantic energy Julian usually carried. "The estate isn't a building, Elias," the thing said, gesturing to the empty, desolate field. "Ironwood is a focus, a lens. It exists where we decide it exists. To the world, it burned to the ground last night. To the board of directors, I am the survivor who will lead them into a new century of growth. But to you, it is whatever you choose it to be." I looked down at the brand on my hand. The skin was puckered and red, the symbol looking like a circle being pulled apart by 2 opposing hooks. It pulsed with a dull heat, synchronized with the pounding in my skull. "Why?" I managed to choke out. "If you have the company, if you have Julian's body, why come for me? You said I was the dead one." The entity laughed, a sound that made the dry grass around us rustle as if in a sudden wind. "Because you are the legal anchor, Elias. The contract doesn't care about skins or possession. It cares about the name on the deed. I can wear Julian's face and use your father's memories, but until you formally pass the birthright to me, willingly, I am a king without a kingdom. I am a ghost, haunting a vacant lot." He held out a hand. "Sign the field over to me. Touch the gate, recognize me as the heir, and you can walk away. I'll provide you with enough untraceable wealth to live 10 lifetimes in whatever corner of the world you choose. You can be free of the Thorn name forever. Isn't that what you always wanted? To be the one who got away?" I looked at the rusted gate standing alone in the dirt. It looked pathetic, a relic of a forgotten age, but I knew that if I touched it, if I acknowledged this monster as my successor, Ironwood would rise again. The Thorn global empire would continue its silent harvest of souls, hiding behind mahogany desks and offshore accounts. "You're trapped," I realized, a small cold spark of hope flickering in my chest. "When I shoved Julian into you, I didn't just crack the vessel. I locked the door from the inside. You can't manifest the wealth without the owner's consent. That's why the house is gone. You're starving." The entity's smile didn't falter, but the skin on its face, Julian's face, began to peel at the edges, revealing a glimpse of the raw, white light underneath. "Starving is a slow process for something as old as I am, Elias. But for you, you have no money, no identity, and the police are currently looking for your charred remains in the rubble of a mansion. How long do you think you'll last before you're begging me for a crust of bread?" I looked at the brand on my hand again. I remembered the woman's words in the cellar. "The birthright is the truth, and the truth is you aren't the one in charge." I remembered the vial of golden liquid, the confession. The confession wasn't a sedative for me. It was a poison for the entity. My father had known that the entity would try to merge with the air. He had filled the vial with the distilled essence of every Thorn's regret, every ounce of guilt and humanity they had suppressed to keep the empire running. By drinking it, or rather by having it shatter and absorb into my skin during the transition, I hadn't become a vessel. I had become the cage. "My father didn't give me his strength, did he?" I said, stepping toward the gate. "He gave me his sickness. He knew that the only way to kill a parasite is to make the host lethal." The entity's eyes widened. For the first time, the Julian mask showed genuine alarm. "Elias, stay back. You don't know what you're doing. If you destroy the anchor, you destroy yourself. Your life is tied to the estate." "Good," I said. "I never liked this house anyway." I reached out and grabbed the rusted iron bars of the gate. The moment my skin touched the metal, the brand on my hand flared with a blinding purple light. The empty field around us began to scream. It wasn't the sound of wind or voices. It was the sound of reality tearing. The ghost image of Ironwood Estate flickered into view. The gray stone walls, the library, the grand staircase, only to be consumed by a torrent of black fire. The entity shrieked. It tried to pull away, but it was tethered to me by the very contract it had tried to exploit. The Julian body began to dissolve, the silk suit turning to ash, the porcelain mask shattering into 1,000 fragments. "Elias!" my father's voice roared from within the light. "You are a thorn! You cannot end what we built! It is eternal!" "It ends with me," I yelled, my voice joining the cacophony of the collapsing world. I felt the golden confession inside me surge. It flowed out of my veins and into the iron gate, acting as a conductor for the 3 centuries of debt the family owed. The weight of it was crushing. I saw the faces of the disappeared, the ruined lives, the blood spilled in the name of the Thorn legacy. I took all of it and shoved it through the gate, into the heart of the entity. The explosion wasn't physical. It was a silent, metaphysical vacuum. I felt my heart stop. I felt my soul being pulled toward the abyss. And then, just as the darkness was about to swallow me whole, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Not the cold, translucent hand of the woman or the iron grip of the entity. It was a warm, firm hand. "Go," a voice whispered. It was my father, but not the Titan, not the monster. It was just a man, sounding exhausted and finally, truly old. The debt is paid. The field is empty. The world went white. I woke up hours later, or perhaps days. I was lying on the side of a highway miles away from the estate. My clothes were singed, and my hand was scarred where the brand had been, but the symbol was gone. In its place was a simple pale circle of skin. I stood up, my legs shaking. I reached into my pocket and found a single item, the blackened key Sterling had shown us in the library. But it wasn't black anymore. It was silver, and it felt light, like it no longer had any locks left to open. I looked back toward the direction of Ironwood. In the distance, a plume of smoke was still rising from the ruins. I checked my phone. It was dead. I had no money, no home, and the world believed Elias Thorne was a pile of ash. I turned away from the smoke and started walking. I walked until I reached a small town. I walked into a diner, and as I sat at the counter, a news report played on the television above the grill. The investigation into the Thorne Global fire continues. In a shocking turn of events, the man previously identified as Julian Thorne has been hospitalized in a catatonic state. Doctors say he has no brain activity, though his vitals remain stable. Meanwhile, the board of Thorne Global has declared bankruptcy following the total disappearance of the company's digital and physical assets overnight. It seems the Thorne empire has vanished as quickly as it rose. I ordered a coffee and paid with a crumpled $20 bill I found in my jacket, the only physical money I had left in the world. As I sipped the bitter brew, I looked at the silver key on the counter. I knew that Julian, or whatever was left of him, would never wake up. The entity was gone, trapped in the void I had created. The birthright was finally truly dead. I was a nobody. I was a ghost. I was a thorn with nothing to my name but the clothes on my back and a future that belonged to no one but me. I picked up the key, walked outside, and tossed it into a nearby storm drain. I didn't wait to hear it hit the bottom. I just kept walking, leaving the shadows of my father's intentions behind me in the dark where they belonged. For the first time in my life, the air didn't taste like old parchment and bourbon. It tasted like rain. And for the first time, the rain didn't feel like it was trying to drown me. It felt like it was washing me clean.